Alright, I think everything is ready now. One of these days I will manage to start on time, but to quote Return to the King, today is not that day. Don't worry, we're going to be getting better at it though. Anyway, hello! Shadowcat back with another lecture, and after thinking about this one for a while, I didn't have anything planned for this Saturday. This one just kind of came as inspiration, so it's a little bit less prepared despite being a much more kind of heavy subject. Heavy in several ways. Heavy because of the political and social ramifications, heavy because of the subject matter on its own. Today we'll be talking about reparations, restitution, retribution, and revenge, each of which could very, very easily be their own lecture on their own. And yet here I am trying to smash them all together into one lecture. This is like the pinnacle of avarice. But here we go anyway. And I can already see that Blizzard Star is in the chat. Hello, Blizz. Good to have you here. But I figured that we would go ahead and we would start this off with a quote from Paradise Lost. Let's see, I can turn this off now because we are started. And this quote that I put up here, wait, Blizz says, get your hard hats, milk and bread, it's going to be spicy. I don't see how those things have to do with each other. I don't see how a hard hat protects you from spicy, and I don't see how milk and bread helps your hard hat. No, you should have brought your entrenching tools, because you're going to be dodging oncoming fire on this one. So anyway, I thought that I would start with a quote, which is not going to be terribly important now, but it will be later. So, even though everyone's had a chance to read it, I'm just going to read it out loud so we can get started. Assume, of course, that I can read my own text. Fortunately, the microphone moves. So this is a quote from Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is not a book that I have read, however, I'll get around to reading it someday, but it basically just covers Lucifer's fall from heaven after the little uprising against God. And so it says, farewell, happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hail horrors, hail infernal world, and thou profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. What matter where, if I be still the same, and what I should be, all but less than he, whom thunder hath made greater. Here at least, we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice. To reign is worth ambition, though in hell, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Those words are going to come back to us later on in this discussion. But now I don't think we need this anymore. We can go ahead and pop this out. There it goes. Alright. So, today's discussion was actually inspired. And it was inspired by a news article from last week, I think it was. Let me see if I can get a date on this. Yeah, March 14th. That's a solid 11 days ago, so a little bit more than a week. And it's a news article from San Francisco, of all places, because California is the place that I keep going back to for inspiration. Why? Because California is doing all the things that are worth talking about. Well, okay, not all the things, but a lot of them. So let's go ahead and bring up this article. Let me drag this down. We've got this from, I believe this is NBC News. Yes. San Francisco board open to reparations with $5 million payouts. The important subheading here is this is a draft of a reparations plan. that was originally released in December, so it's been a long time talked about, unmatched nationwide in its specificity and its breadth. Now, of course, this has had a lot of people talking about it. People, they're discussing, whether this is good, whether this is bad, their thoughts on reparations in general. Honestly, I don't want to get into it. And I know, that's weird saying because it's all talk about reparations, but I don't want to get into too much this. We're going to get into this as a foundation, but we're going to use this as a springboard to jump off into other conversations. Because while I don't care too much about this plan in particular, I do want to speak to the idea of reparations as a whole. So if we look through this article, and we will just do a very, very brief read over. This actually says by the Associated Press, so I guess not even by NBC News. Either way, payments of $5 million to every eligible black adult, the elimination of personal debt and tax burdens, guaranteed annual incomes of at least $97,000 for 250 years, and homes in San Francisco for just $1 a family. These were some of the more than 100 recommendations made by a city-appointed reparations committee, tasked with the thorny question of how to atone for centuries of slavery and systemic racism. And the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, hearing the report for the first time Tuesday, voiced enthusiastic support for the ideas listed, with some saying the money should not stop the city from doing the right thing. Now, right here, already, we have a few points that we're going to be covering. We're going to be covering the idea of systemic harms, past damages, and doing the right thing. These are going to be the core concepts that I want to cover today. Several supervisors said they were surprised to hear pushback from politically liberal San Francisco, apparently unaware that the legacy of slavery and racist policies continues to keep black Americans on the bottom rungs of health, education, economic prosperity, and overrepresented in prisons and homeless populations. Quote, "Those of my constituents who lost their minds about this proposal, it's not something we're doing or we would do for other people. It's something we would do for our future, for everyone's collective future," end quote, said Supervisor Rafael Mandelman, whose district includes a heavily LGBTQ Castro neighborhood. Draft reparations plan released in December is unmatched nationwide. We saw that in the headline. They haven't done an analysis of the cost of the proposals, but critics have slammed the plan as financially and politically impossible. These are also things that I'm going to come back to, because these are going to be important right here. An estimate from Stanford University's Hoover Institution, which leans conservative, has said that it would cost each non-black family in the city at least $600,000. And of course, this is all going to come from taxpayer money, so this is where the tax breaks come for anyone receiving it. After all, you wouldn't want to have them paying into a system that's also paying them back. The article goes on, but by and large, we don't need to look at a whole lot of it. There's a lot of quotes, a lot of back and forth. By and large, we don't need it. This is all the foundation we really need to get started. Because reparations is not something that is new. Not for the US, not for many countries around the world. In fact, with the help of... Oop, not that one. Wrong button. We want to keep our little background music. That button. With the help of ChatGPT, I have gone through and done a few inquiries into historical databases, news archives and whatnot, just because ChatGPT is awesome for that kind of thing. So one of the first things that I did is that I went back into some historical archives and I asked it to pull up some examples from history of reparations that have been paid out primarily by the US, but because ChatGPT is a little bit wonky still, that's not a down, I'm not insulting it, I'm just saying there's room for improvement. It did give me some examples from other countries. That's actually not terribly a bad thing. But let's go through some examples here. So, reparations that have been paid out or proposed through U.S. history. Mostly these have been paid out. But the first one has not, and that was 40 acres and a mule. This is the first one that has really ever been brought to prominence because it's the first time we ever, as a nation, said, a wrong has been done and we must fix it. And hello, Tuxedo, it's good to have you here. So the first one is 40 acres and a mule, which was proposed by William T. Sherman after 1865, promising that newly freed slaves would receive 40 acres of land and a mule. This promise was never fulfilled. I can't find any specific data on where and how much was fulfilled. These things are rarely either all or nothing. I'm sure that in some places it must have happened, I just can't find numbers. Reparations for the Japanese Americans in 1988. President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which provided reparations for Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. This included a formal apology and $20,000 in compensation for each surviving internee. There were reparations for the Holocaust survivors. This is a non-U.S. example. This was from 1952 in Germany. Payments for reparations to Holocaust survivors, which continue to this day as of 2021, which is when ChatGPT stops its records because that's all they updated it to. So as of 2021, the German government has paid out over $80 billion in reparations. The Tulsa Massacre in 2021 in the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, they announced it would provide reparations to survivors and descendants of the 1921 Tulsa Massacre, in which a white mob destroyed a prosperous black community, killing an estimated 300 people. And of course, reparations for slavery. This is going to be very important because this is going to be kind of one of the big ones we talk about today. There's been several proposals made over the year, including a bill introduced by Representative John Conveyors in 1989, and the more recent H.R. 40 bill. Of course, you've got to remember that ChatGPT comes from 2021, so it's about 2 years out of date. There have been more recent proposals. Reparations for forced sterilization. This was in 2013 from North Carolina. This was victims of the state's forced sterilization program, which targeted people deemed unfit and sterilized without their consent. This came from, if I recall correctly, back in the 1940s, 50s? I don't remember, though. It doesn't really matter the exact time. The fact is that it happened. There have been reparations for indigenous people, what we would call the Indians, or Native Americans, although I'm less inclined, given modern sensibilities, to use the term Native Americans. So, indigenous people, this is for historical injustices that they have faced, including forced removal from their lands, forced assimilation. There has been reparations for the Flint water crisis, in which the state of Michigan announced a $641 million settlement lawsuit related to the Flint water crisis. And there's a couple more examples, but I think we've been on these for a bit too long. There was another one for police brutality during the BLM protests/riots, because, let's be honest, the minute you set something on fire, it's no longer a protest, and I am not going to budge on that one. But that'll be an important one to bring up later as well. Also, reparations for redlining, which has been a nationwide thing. You can't really nail that one down to any one place. Redlining was a practice across the country. Then there were some that did not pass. As we already mentioned, there were reparations for slavery. Several have been introduced, none have been passed. Reparations for Japanese Latin Americans, similar to the internment of Japanese Americans, but this is just adding on another factor. It did not pass. More reparations for the victims of the Tulsa Massacre, although it just did say that there had been. Let me double check this. Again, ChatGPT is a little bit weird. So in the previous example, it said that Tulsa, Oklahoma announced that it would provide reparations. This one is talking about... yes, Tulsa has announced that it will provide reparations. There have been no federal reparations from the event, so nothing from the country as a whole. Reparations for forced labor from World War II. Thousands of German prisoners of war were used in forced labor camps in the United States. It did not pass, although that is something very important to bring up. Everybody remembers from World War II that there was a Japanese internment. What most people don't think about or don't know about is there were similar camps for German Americans who were either interred or, in this case, used as forced labor. The same thing happened at the same time for Italian Americans who were subject to internment and other discrimination. Again, World War II. Germany, Italy, both part of the Axis. Again, reparations for redlining. Many have been paid out, many have not been paid out. Reparations for police brutality. This is one that we've seen across the country, especially in the wake of the 2020 riots. There were reparations that were demanded for Native American boarding schools. This was when, after the reservationing of Native Americans, we tried to move or to force them to assimilate by taking the children out of native lands and putting them into American boarding schools. While the practice was usually horrific, it has not had any kind of reparations after it. There's been no federal reparations for the forced sterilization, and interestingly enough, for Hurricane Katrina, there's also been a call for reparations there, since there's been accusations that the response to Hurricane Katrina specifically either targeted or ignored communities of minority cultures. So these are some examples of reparations that have and have not been paid out. And I wanted to use this as a foundation as we get into this discussion. I mean, nothing makes a better foundation than examples. So now that we've got that done, why don't we go into some definitions? And I have many of them here, and I have many of them from many examples. In fact, I went through and I got definitions from multiple sources and then just tried to boil them down to a common consensus. So when it comes to reparations, what we have here is the idea that reparations are a form of compensation or restitution, and keep that word in mind. Restitution for harm or damage done by a country or responsible party, often in the context of war or historical injustices. Additionally, they have often been seen as a process that involves acknowledging and addressing root causes for injustice to promote reconciliation and social cohesion. This is a really good definition, because it'll give us something that we can compare and contrast from. We've already seen that it has a comparison by using restitution inside of its definition. And so we'll get to that. But I think the key points here is that when it comes to reparations, and when we want to differentiate it from restitution, generally speaking, we're talking about a much broader community. We're not talking about an individual or even a business or a corporation. We're talking on a cultural, regional, or national scale. And the scaling is what's really going to become important later on. At least I believe. Part of this is going to be conjecture on my part, speculation, and opinion. I do what I can. If we get into the idea of restitution, though, just because I want to be able to compare and contrast right now. Restitution refers to the act of making amends for a wrong or harm done, usually returning something that was taken or lost, or by compensating for the loss or damage caused. Restitution is often seen as a form of justice that seeks to restore a victim to the position they would have been in had the harm not occurred, and the act of restoring something that's been lost or damaged to its original state, or its value is a common form of restitution. So now we have the idea of reparations and restitution together. why don't we kind of compare and contrast them? So we have restitution, which is basically the idea of making whole. So we can say that you have been damaged, and you have been damaged to a degree that we can kind of measure. If I was to wreck your car, we can sit down and we can figure out how much was the car worth, how old was it, how much had it depreciated, what would have been its current value now. And then we can say the party injured is owed either a replacement car of similar value or monetary compensation equal to that value. This is restitution. It is simply returning you from the point that you are damaged to the point where you are whole again. The idea being, we're going to try and make this as if it never happened. Now, how does this contrast rather, with the idea of reparations? Reparations, at least as far as I can understand it, are a way of trying to manage restitution, but with the caveat that you cannot actually measure the damage done. Either because there is no metric to use, or because we just simply cannot fathom the amount of damage done. The easy example to go back to here would be the Japanese internment, as mentioned above. When reparations were made for the Japanese-American internment during World War II, the reparations were a formal apology from the federal government that did it, plus an additional $20,000 for every surviving internee. And Tuxedo asks, TikTok has damaged me. Can I get reparations? Probably not. But I say probably because things be crazy sometimes. We're going to get to that. However, you might have to seek those reparations from China. Good luck. Anyway, as I was saying about the Japanese internment, the reparations involved a formal apology and a $20,000 payout to all surviving internees. The immediate question that we must first ask then is that making them whole? When we talk about restitution, the idea is to get people back to whole. They have been damaged, and they are now going to be whole. Well, how do we measure that? I mean, in the case of, say, somebody being suspended unfairly from work, you could simply go back and say, well, you have been suspended from work for X time unfairly, and so we'll compensate you for your lost wages. That would be very simple. But now, we're talking about more than just Japanese Americans who had been taken away from their jobs and precluded from working. We're not talking about just lost wages. They were taken from their homes. They lost their jobs and their businesses. I mean, forget if they just had a job. If they were a business owner, which you have to remember during that time, many people owned their own businesses. The idea of big businesses didn't really exist there. The idea was that most people owned their own businesses. Maybe they employed a few people. You had a much greater array of community-owned businesses and community economy. So many of those people interred would have had businesses. Those businesses would have been completely annihilated by being imprisoned. And imprisoned for no other reason than their genetics. So while we're on that same subject, this was imprisonment. And I would even go so far as to say it was false imprisonment, because these people, of course, had done no wrong. We have a law for that. We call it false imprisonment. Now, this goes beyond false imprisonment, of course. We have statutes on the books where we can actually penalize people for false imprisonment. We have monetary punishments. We have statutory punishments. But this was more than that. These people were rounded up en masse, falsely imprisoned, but not in a prison. They were put into camps. Camps that were horrifying, to say the least. People died. And not one or two. A lot of people died. And it's not like this was a death camp. No. In a death camp, yes, lots of people died because they were rounded up into gas chambers and murdered en masse, or they were lined up against a wall and shot. That would have been merciful compared to what was happening in the internment camps, because people in the internment camps died of starvation and disease. It was bad. There is a reason why it is one of the most horrific events in U.S. history. How do you put a price tag on that? $20,000 may have been seen as an almost insultingly low amount, and perhaps it was. But the question here is, what could you possibly have paid to make that right? A formal apology may have also seemed paltry in comparison, but what else could you do? And this is where I do believe that reparations and restitution differ. One of them can be measured, one of them cannot be. And so with these two things in hand, I think we need to move on a little bit. And I know we might seem like we're moving a little bit fast here. I don't know if this is necessarily going to be a long discussion, but I think it's an important one to have. So when we move on to the subject of retribution. Now, when we do this, I want to bring up a legal theory. So, let's see, criminal punishment. Let's see, criminal punishment is going to be... I have this in my notes here. The ideas of legal punishment come down to deterrence, retribution, or incapacitation. And so I actually have something here. Or I had something here anyway. Where was it? What did I do with it? Never mind. I lost it. I'll have to go with the notes that I have instead of the explanation that I had. This is what I get for not being prepared properly. That's alright. I got this. I got this. So the idea of legal punishments is deterrence, retribution, and incapacitation. Now, we just covered retribution. Or, no, we just covered, there's too many R's. What am I doing here? We just covered restitution. We're getting to retribution. Deterrence. So we'll start with deterrence. And what is deterrence? Well, to deter someone is to dissuade them from it, to make them think twice before they do a thing. The idea of deterrence is that if we have somebody who commits a wrong, whether that be a moral wrong, a social wrong, or a legal wrong, the idea is that we punish them. And the punishment has its own effect. However, it should also, in theory, have a chilling effect on other people who might want to do the same thing. Whether this works or not is up for debate, and is a debate that has been held long and hard by people much smarter and much more experienced than me. But the idea is simple. If somebody steals a car, and we put them in jail, then next time somebody goes to steal a car, perhaps they'll think better of it. Now, in some cases this works, in some cases it doesn't. Again, all of these topics could be part of a much, much longer discussion. But that's the idea behind it. Next, of course, is retribution. And retribution and deterrence kind of go hand in hand. The idea of retribution, of course, is that you have done a wrong, and now you're going to be punished for it. In fact, we have a definition for retribution right here. So after scouring multiple different definition sources, a good consensus is a punishment of wrongdoers or criminals as a form of justice, often as a consequence for some offense or wrongdoing, often seen as a way of balancing the harm caused by an offense with the harm caused by the punishment, and the punishment often seen as proportional to the severity of the offense committed. There's some very, very important words in there. The first of which is consequence. It is a form of harm. It is a form of harm that we agree upon, because this is a form of law. And if you go back to the very first direct message that I ever did, I talked about law as a form of social consensus. What we agree the law is what the law is. This is one of the reasons why if there's a law in the books but nobody is following it and nobody is enforcing it, it's not really a law. It is a law in nothing but name. And a law in nothing but name is nothing. On the other hand, if we all agree that something is wrong, then we don't actually need a law for it. We'll punish it ourselves in whatever method we see fit. So, there has to be a consequence that pertains to some law or rule. Otherwise, you're just simply harming people. And then we get back to the whole restitution and retribution part of this. But consequence, very important there. So it has to be a consequence, and it has to be a balance, proportional to the severity of the offense committed. This means that, again, much like that, this is the opposite side of restitution, where restitution seeks to make the person who lost their car whole, either with a new car or with the cost of a car. The other side of that is retribution, by taking from the person who did the damage. Either take their vehicle and give it to the person who lost theirs, or to take monetarily from them and give to the person who lost theirs. This is something that we're all familiar with the idea of fines and imprisonment as punishments. If you do something and we assess retribution against you, we do so either by harming you in a way that would be similar to the way they were harmed, and thus you basically get a taste of your own medicine, and if you don't like it, then don't do that anymore. We get back to the deterrence idea. There is one more, however, and that is incapacitation. See, incapacitation literally means to prevent you from doing anything again. You're incapacitated. You're incapable. The idea here is that we do something in such a way, we penalize you to a point where you can no longer harm anyone again. Generally speaking, we see this as imprisonment, or restricting somebody in some way. For example, if you have somebody who steals a car, and they either wreck the car, scrap the car, or sell the car, we can assess restitution from them to make the person who lost their car whole and to punish the person who did it. That's fine. But what if they do it again? Well, we can assess restitution and retribution again. But what if they're going to continue doing this over and over and over again? What if the idea of retribution in a monetary sense is not a deterrence? In that case, the only thing we have left is to physically stop them from doing it. That means to lock them in a prison, or lock them in their house, or in some way prevent them from going near cars anymore, because if they can't go near the car, they can't steal the car. Incapacitation. Sometimes we can go as low as simple house arrest and say, you're allowed to leave for work and food and things of this nature, but you're not allowed to travel freely. Sometimes this goes as far up as a life sentence without parole. In some places, it may even go as far as the death penalty. Simply saying, we have deemed you as a danger to society, and we're going to remove you from the society permanently. Incapacitation, when pretty much everything else fails. But these are all forms of punishment. And I would say that all of these are a form of retribution, even though retribution is listed in them. So, just to repeat, retribution and restitution, kind of two sides of the same coin. So, if we take that, we can say that retribution is harming somebody as a consequence proportional to the damage they've done. We can go back to our restitution part and say, for somebody who has been harmed, we make them whole. We do so at the expense of the person who harmed them, just by combining these two things into one. However, now I want to go back and do a secondary comparison. We understand that restitution and retribution are two sides of the same coin, but what if we take the restitution off of there? And we instead go with reparations. So now we have reparations and retribution. Okay? So as I stated before, this is kind of a one-sided conversation. I mean, you can talk back to me if you want. I can't hear you, but we can have that conversation. It's just going to be very one-sided. The idea of reparations, as I explained earlier, is similar to restitution, except it doesn't have a measurement. There is no true way to gauge what was lost, what was damaged. We're talking something on a scale that is just immeasurable. That's important because when we go back to the idea of retribution, very importantly, we have to go back to those words consequence and proportional. So we've already got the consequence part of that. We're saying that there was a historical wrong done on a cultural, regional, or national scale. Got that. Consequences. Proportional. Because you have to remember that we're talking about something in which we can't even measure the damage done to make restitution. If we cannot measure the damage done for restitution, how then can we measure the proportion for retribution? And this is where the idea of reparations begins to fall apart. I want to go back to that article for just one moment, where they talked about how this would cost each individual taxpayer in San Francisco who wasn't receiving the reparations an estimated minimum of $600,000. And we must ask ourselves, is this proportional? And are these even consequences? Now let's talk about that first one for a brief minute. Or not the first one, the second one. Consequences. Second one. I want to talk about consequences for a minute. In the San Francisco example, $600,000 from every non-black resident. Now, much as during World War II, when we had the Japanese internment, people were rounded up and interred for no other reason than simply being of Japanese descent. They had committed no crime, they had done nothing wrong, and in most cases, they were upstanding, hardworking members of their community. But because of their genetic background, they were rounded up. In a similar vein, when it comes to these San Francisco reparations, The fact is that these fines, well, they're not really fines, but these payments will be assessed through taxes. After all, the city will be paying the reparations. The city doesn't have any money. Government doesn't have money. Government has taxes. Government takes money, and then government redistributes money, but government doesn't have money. They have a budget that they never ever stick to. But that's a concept, or that's a discussion for another day. So, all of these reparations will be assessed through taxes. These taxes will be, of course, collected from every person in the city who is not on the receiving end. These taxes could just as easily be seen as a fine. After all, we had our tax base, and if you're going to increase taxes to account for this, it's really just a way of assessing a fine on a mass scale. After all, if you are fined by a court and you don't pay your fines, then people with shiny badges and black guns will come and find you, and they will either make you pay or they will put you in jail. Similarly, if the taxes are assessed and you don't pay them, people with shiny badges and black guns will come and either force you to pay or take you to jail. You can dress it up however you like, you can code it in whatever words you want, but if the action is the same, then we can call them the same. So we're going to treat these as if they were simply fines assessed against the population at large. And again, this is a fine, this is a consequence, a punishment being assessed against a group of people, in this case, San Franciscans? I think it's San Franciscans. I'm not sure. Regardless, they are being assessed against these people by dint that they live in San Francisco. This is really no different than had they gone into a largely Japanese-American community back in World War II and simply said, anybody with slightly narrow eyes, get on the bus. It may not be the same in scale or severity, but it is the same in practice. And practice is what's important, because it doesn't really matter the scale. If the practice is still there, it can scale however far or near it needs to. It's the practice that is the problem, not the scale of it. Any wrong, regardless of how big or small it is a wrong. And so in this case, we are assessing consequences from people who have committed no offense or wrongdoing. That's the first problem that we have here. But it is largely the most important one. Of slightly secondary importance, then, is even if you could assess the people who were guilty of it, and when we're talking about reparations for slavery in the United States, and really slavery anywhere else in the world for that matter, I don't see how this has to be a US issue when slavery has been a worldwide issue. When it comes to assessing the guilty, even if you could, then how do you assess a proportional punishment to it? We're not talking just the price of a person. We do have some historical records where we could say a slave was sold for... how much does slave usually go for? I want to say that a field slave back in the agricultural South usually sold for about $1,000 to $1,500. I think. I'm kind of wildly guessing here, but I think I heard something similar to that once upon a time. But anyway, we have records from back then, and we can go back and see what was paid. It would be very, very easy to go back and say, was a person enslaved, do they have descendants? Now, that's already a slippery slope, because paying the descendants of them and not the people who were actually enslaved is making restitution to somebody who actually has not been wronged in their life. Now, there are arguments that can be made that perhaps because they've had this in their history, they have been hampered in some way. They've been crippled in some way from developing. That is a philosophical discussion. And as with any philosophical discussion, it has no right, concrete answer. There is no way that we will ever be able to assess this. Which is also similar why, even if we could get these people, simply giving them the equivalent of what they were paid for is not even going to brush the surface of what they might be owed for being enslaved on a plantation in the South during slavery times. We're talking not just the fact that they had been enslaved and sold, but we're talking a literal lifetime of hard labor, the loss, or, well, not the loss, but never having had freedom, never having had rights, and that's assuming that they were working in a place that actually treated them nicely. There were plantations that treated their slaves rather well. After all, a slave was an investment. You did not really want to break it. At the same time, though, there were plantations where the slaves were treated absolutely horridly, with regular beatings and maimings and killings. How could you possibly assess the damages for that? On top of the loss or lack of freedom for an entire lifetime, on top of being a slave in the first place. It is not something that could be calculated in numbers, because it doesn't translate to numbers. There is no way that we could simply say, here is an amount of money, this makes it better. Which, of course, has been one of the major complaints about reparations ever since they've been talked about. Because when we go back to the idea of reparations and retribution, there is nothing proportional about it. The only way to truly be proportional in something such as this would be to inflict the exact same treatment upon the person who caused it. So if a person was to steal a car, you would take their car and give it to this other person. If a person was to steal money, you would take money from them and give it back to the person who was stolen from. Similarly, if somebody has been a slave, the only really proportional response would be to enslave that person for an equal amount of time. But is that really even proportional? This is where we're going to get out of the realm of retribution, and we're going to slip ever so smoothly from a proportional consequence into a disproportional consequence. I want to move from the idea of retribution into revenge. While restitution and retribution may be seen as two sides of the same coin, I believe that reparations and revenge can also similarly be seen as two sides of the same coin. After all, the idea of revenge, as I could find a definition for it, would read as thus. Revenge involves retaliation or punishment in response to a perceived injustice or wrongdoing. It often involves a desire to get even or inflict harm on somebody who has caused harm or injury to oneself. Revenge can be seen as a form of retribution or punishment, often motivated by a sense of justice or desire for retribution. However, Revenge can also be seen as a negative or destructive force, as it often perpetuates a cycle of violence that can lead to further harm or suffering. Now, it's very important, not so much the cycle of violence, because if it was retributive, then it really wouldn't lead to a cycle necessarily. That is assuming, of course, that it was proportional and measured. Revenge is usually cyclical because it is not measured or proportional. It can be, sometimes, but it's almost never perceived that way. But the idea of revenge, for whatever reason, whether it is retaliatory, whether it is retributive, it's always about suffering. There is usually no monetary way to enact revenge. There can be. But in general, it is done in a way that makes another party suffer. It harms them. It harms them in a way that is not measured, except by the person who has been harmed. And because it's being done by the person who was harmed, it's usually biased, partial, and, well, I just said it, it's unmeasured. There is no way to gauge how much is enough. Now, why do I want to pair revenge with reparations? Because it is kind of a philosophical concept. Again, when it comes to reparations, we're talking about something that can't be measured, which means that if you cannot measure it, there is no objective right answer for how much is enough. When we talked about the San Francisco example of reparations, when it made headlines, and it did make headlines across the country, it did so because the idea of giving $5 million to every black person who, by the way, slavery ended in 1865. Now, granted, there was discrimination after that, but we're talking about reparations for slavery primarily. That was almost 150 years ago? No, 160 years ago. Let's see. 1865 to 1965 would be 100. 1965 to 2025 would be 60. So, 158 years ago. There is nobody, slave or slaveholder, who is still alive today, at least from the United States slavery period. So, none of those people can receive any kind of reparations, and revenge can be taken against none of those people who held slaves. So already, the idea of getting restitution or revenge and reparations or restitution to any person that was harmed from any person who did the harming is already out the window. There is no way that we can even begin to make any kind of objective measurement on what could be done. So now we are completely off the measurement. This is completely philosophical now. We are trying to put numbers to feelings. So now that we're on that one, how much is enough? Can we all agree on what is enough? You do have some people who are proponents of modern day reparations who say reparations were owed. And so the reparations owed were 40 acres and a mule. What if we were to go through lineages and say any person who is directly descended from a person who was enslaved, since they were owed 40 acres and a mule, we provide them with exactly what they were owed. After all, there is a lot of territory across the U.S. that is held by the state. Remember, any land not owned by a person is owned by the government. There's a lot of land out there owned by the government. So the government could very easily parcel that off and say 40 acres and a mule to any person. This has been suggested before, and it has been largely laughed off because, well, from modern day standards, well, that's crazy. Most people wouldn't even know what to do with a mule, much less the 40 acres. But if we wanted to go with what was owed, technically, wouldn't that be the best place to start? So how do we get from 40 acres and a mule to $5 million? But not $5 million on its own, no. Let's remember that it was $5 million as a start. We're also talking about a guaranteed income for every black person in San Francisco of $97,000. That's every year for 250 years. This means that this will be a reparations payout to exceed the lifetime of any person now living, which of course will continue to be assessed from the people still living in San Francisco during that time. That means that after another 150 years, when nobody living or nobody alive today is still there, the descendants of those black families will still be getting $97,000 a year from the descendants of those families who their only crime was living there. So you will have people in the next generation paying the people of the next generation. Again, we have to go back to the idea of retribution. Is this a consequence of anything that they have done? And is this proportional to their crimes? Given that their crime was simply living in San Francisco and wasn't actually harmful to anybody, it is most certainly not proportional. So if it's not proportional, or it's not a consequence, then it's not retribution. It's revenge. And the idea of revenge is that it doesn't have to be measured. It doesn't have to even really have a consequence. It generally does. In this case, though, it's not a consequence against the individual. The individual is now a victim of a consequence against an entire, well, race. Although I would struggle to even call it a race, because that would be if you were just collecting it from a single race. In this case, you're collecting it from every white person in San Francisco, every Hispanic person in San Francisco, every Asian person in San Francisco, and I do believe that they have a few of those, and even other black people who don't have any kind of ties back to slavery periods. Let's remember that black is a very large racial group. Black could mean slavery descended in the US. It could also mean Caribbean descended. It could mean African descended. And so these people would similarly be punished along with everybody else. Is any of this proportional? It is not. So we come back to the idea of revenge. Now, why is this important? It's important because revenge, since it is not proportional, means that it can be scaled. And it can be scaled to any degree, in both terms of monetary, or both terms of scale, both the amount of punishment assessed and the number of people affected, and it can be scaled in terms of duration. We've already seen for 250 years. This is a scale of duration that will punish people long into the future. People who may not have even known about this, because after 100 years, you have people who are going to become or be adults at this point who will be paying taxes, and these payments will be assessed inside of those taxes. Meaning that they might not even be notified that they're being punished for this. This is not any kind of restitution, this is revenge. And in terms of scale, $5 million to every black or technically black identifying person, because in order to be eligible for this, you simply have to be black identifying for a period of 10 years in San Francisco. You're going to have people who apply for this and who theoretically even receive it, who were never actually affected by it. So now we're going to have people receiving the benefits of restitution who were never harmed. From people who never did anything wrong. And that's not all. Another popular one was the idea of personal debt elimination. Now consider the following. Personal debt elimination. Now that generally means that they're not talking about things like student debt or things of that nature. Personal debt would be loans, whether that be a bank loan or a mortgage or credit card debt. Personal debt. If personal debt falls under the idea of reparations, who is it reparations from? After all, it would be very, very difficult to blame your credit card debt on the idea of historic slavery or discrimination. Now, if I had to guess, this is speculation on my part, the assumption would be that because of historical slavery, because of historical discrimination, it prevented all those opportunities from making a person even wealthier than they might have already been. Ergo, since they weren't this level of wealth, they have had to go into debt to live this certain degree of lifestyle. That is probably the excuse that would be used, but again, that would also be an excuse because it makes a whole lot of unfounded assumptions. The first assumption is, of course, that if this hadn't happened, this person would, of course, be, very wealthy now. We covered the slippery slope argument last week, I believe, and we covered the idea of logical progression. This is an argument with no logical progression because it is an A-B statement when it should be an A-Z statement. There is no logical progression there. You would need to say that because of because of previous discrimination, this opportunity was completely denied. This one was suspended. This one was hindered, and it has moved up to the point where this was unattainable. But because we don't have those intervening steps, we have no reason to say that this wasn't unattainable for reasons outside of personal control. And so, using the idea of reparations to eliminate personal debt, it doesn't really track. So instead, what they're proposing is personal debt elimination for the sake of just race or ethnicity for this particular group, which of course is going to be rolled right back into the taxes that everyone else is going to have to pay, because one of two things has to happen to that debt. Either the debt holder, whether that be a bank or corporation, will have to simply release the debt and take the loss, or the city of San Francisco would have to pay it off. And if it happens to be the latter, again, government doesn't have money. So that will have to be assessed through taxes from everybody else. Then there's the idea of converting public housing into condos. In general, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, why not? I don't see a problem with that. You want to convert public housing into condos? Great, do it. It literally affects nothing, and it might even be good economically. But then they want it sold to these people receiving reparations for exactly $1. Now, the reason it's being sold for $1 is because by making the sale for $1, it's basically free. I mean, just about anybody can come up with $1. A homeless person under a bridge can come up with $1. But because it was paid for, it is not a gift. It is a transaction, and it is now wholly owned by that person. So we're going to take and we're going to essentially give away free housing to all of these people. Of course, where is the money going to come from for these houses? To have them renovated into condos, to have them reapportioned as now condos and not public housing. It will all be assessed from the taxpayer, which is going to be literally everybody else. And these were only some of the most popular of over 100 suggestions added onto these bills. The more you add, the less proportional it gets. Even if we could no longer assess what the proportion would have been, the fact is that we can't, which means that retribution in this case would be wholly unwarranted, which means that our base restitution is 0. It cannot be proven, therefore it cannot be done. If we're going to do it anyway, we start from a base of 0, and it only goes up from there. This is, quite frankly, and quite blatantly, revenge. Now, revenge tends to be more personal. So, revenge from what? Well, the idea here is that it is revenge for past misdeeds, for past harms. However, that is a flimsy excuse at best. Because when we acknowledge the fact that we're assessing retribution from people who have done no wrong, then we cannot use any kind of logic to cloak this. If we throw out the logic then, and we can say there is no logical progression here, then we have to ask ourselves, if not this, then what else? The unfortunate answer here is that there is no answer. I can't give you one. And to be quite honest, I don't think they could either. Many people will want to point to racism. And I'm not going to tell them they're wrong because they're not. The unfortunate part here is that we are talking about a massive group of people. It is not a small group that has been calling for reparations, it is massive. And with a statistically large mass, you're going to have basically every single probability fulfilled inside of this statistical mass. Is it because of race? Yes, according to a certain segment of this population. Will it have other reasons? Also, yes. Will you have both, anthropological and legal scholars in there making a measured argument for why these things have to be done? Well, of course you will. I know nobody's going to argue that. They're making good arguments right now. The problem is, while they are making good arguments, their arguments are also flawed. As I've said, there is no way to measure this, so there is no way to make it proportional. So while they may have arguments, they will always be flawed. You'll also have a group of people who will literally do and say anything for selfish reasons. I don't necessarily know how big or small this group is. It could be very small. It could be very big. But if you're going to dangle the idea of $5 million in front of any black identifying person in San Francisco, well, as they say, every man has their price. You're going to have enough people that will say, look, I might not be owed this, but $5 million would change my life. And so I will literally do or say anything at all, to change my life. And that is where we're going to get into the quote that I started with. Because if you remember the end of the quote that I put up before, and you know what? Let me put that back up now, just so you have something else to look at besides my lovely podium here. I'm kidding, it's not my podium. I just found it on Google Images. Looks good though, right? Again, this was a passage from Paradise Lost, and the last line reads, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." And why did I want to bring that up? Why did I say that was going to be very important later on? The reason is actually simple. As it was pointed out in the definition of revenge earlier, it often perpetuates a cycle of violence and can lead to further harm or suffering. The fact is that we could go ahead, San Francisco could go ahead and give out these reparations. $5 million to every black identifying person, a guaranteed income of $97,000 per person identifying for 250 years. Complete personal debt elimination, converting public housing into condos, which will then be given away for free, along with potentially a myriad of other things. All of this for 250 years. This is supposed to be reparations for slavery and discrimination. And what is it doing in turn? Well, the taxes are already high enough that most people are struggling to begin with. If you taxed on an additional $600,000 tax burden per person not receiving reparations, how much more are you going to have to raise those taxes? I don't know what the tax rate in California is already, but if it's already above 50%, and I think it is, how much higher can it go? 55%? 60? 65? At what point are you making another slave class? There have been proposals from the state of California because as they kept raising their taxes, as they kept instituting new policies which were, lax on crime and things like that, people were leaving California in droves. California's response to this was to attempt, and I do say attempt because, number one, they never passed it, and number two, even if they did, it's completely unenforceable, but they wanted to tax any person who left California for leaving California. In other words, they wanted to assess the person for state income taxes in another state as a punishment for leaving California. They didn't want people to be allowed to leave. Slaves are not allowed to leave. And did you know that during slavery times, I told you in slavery in the US, there were good plantations and there were bad plantations. The bad plantations were really bad. But the good ones were actually really good. While I cannot speak directly to what it's like to be a slave, and I cannot even imagine what it would be like to be one, on some of the best plantations, slaves actually enjoyed great amounts of freedom, to the point where they were technically owned, and they technically had a master they had to return to, who they had to obey. Slaves did receive money, and they had freedom of movement. After all, they would need it. They would need to be able to handle certain amounts of finance if they were to go to town to pick up supplies. I mean, if you only have slaves who are working either in the house or the field, who goes to town to pick up lumber to build a new barn? Who goes to town to pick up food that you're not producing on your plantation, especially if it's something like a tobacco plantation. You're not eating what you're growing. Ergo, somebody has to go to town to go grocery shopping. There were slaves who enjoyed a great deal of freedom. But, however, they were owned by a master, and if anything happened, their master was responsible for them. Similarly, people in San Francisco who were being taxed under these policies would have the complete freedom to live in their own house and to go to work. In fact, they would need to go to work. They would need to have an income. Because if they don't have an income, how else can they pay? And you see more and more how the unmeasured, disproportionate reaction to these previous wrongs, foisted as reparations. On the flip side, they are revenge. Revenge against a perceived group that has done wrong in the past. And as in my previous example, what could possibly be the only appropriate retribution for somebody who has taken your freedom, who has taken your life, who has hurt you immeasurably? The only true retribution would be to take away their freedom, take away their life, and hurt them immeasurably. But there is one stark difference here, which I've already mentioned before and I will reiterate here. No person alive today has had their freedom taken away from them, their life taken away from them, and been harmed immeasurably by slavery. And as a matter of fact, there is a vanishing group of people who have even been harmed by discrimination in the US, at least from anti-black discrimination. You must remember that the Civil Rights Act was signed in, I believe, 1968. That means that any person who was born in 1967, the last year that anybody could have theoretically claimed to have been disadvantaged by it, a person born in 1967 would be, 3 to 70, and then 70 to 20 would be 50, plus 3 would be 56 years old now. The average lifespan of a human being in the current world, in the current first world I should say, is about 75 to 80 years old. Any person who was at the very tail end of racial discrimination would be 56 years old now, and they would have literally grown up in a world where they never even knew what it was like. The people who did, the people who were adult, working men and women during that time, people who were in their 20s, 30s, 40s, or 50s, are either dying or dead. There is a vanishing population of people for whom these reparations would even apply in the slightest degree, meaning that this will almost certainly be assessed to a population who has never, ever experienced it, and for whom any disadvantage that they might have had is, by every definition of the word, completely theoretical. Now, theoretical does not mean that there have not been any effects. After all, gravity is a theory. It is the theory of gravity. We can show evidence of theory, but we have yet to prove how gravity works. Similarly, there is a theory that people have suffered to this day because of previous discrimination. What's missing, though, is the evidence. And until we have the evidence for that, we can really make no assessment. Which means that this is not retribution, it is revenge against an entire population who has done nothing wrong. And here's where we get back into the cyclical part of that. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. It would be possible. It is not going to happen, but it would be possible for people as a whole to let go. To live and let live. And we've seen this. By and large, does anybody talk about the Japanese internment these days? The answer is no. Part of that is because there were reparations that were paid out for the Japanese internment. Whether they were good, whether they were bad, is really kind of immaterial. I mean, we can't speak to that because we're not those people. But we also don't talk about it anymore. We don't continue to harp on it. We're not saying it wasn't enough. We're not saying that it needed more. We let it go. The same thing goes with many other things. For example, Native American reparations. While there may be reparations owed, the fact is we can't possibly assess them. What we did is, in return for moving these people off of their land, we gave them reservations. We have said this land belongs to these tribes. You will always have people who will complain about this. People who were saying, well, we once controlled more territory, or we don't like being restricted to this much land. We should be able to expand it. You will always have people who want more. And those people are willing to do just about anything to get it. Again, we go back to greed. The idea of greed. Greed, wrath, pride, all of those. Almost every single one of them is inside of this argument. You will always have people who will want more, and people for whom whatever reparations you have will never, ever be enough. This is why every time we look at reparations from slavery era, it always seems to go up. Nobody wants 40 acres and a mule anymore. 40 acres and a mule was supposed to be land to farm, to build your house, to raise your family. But what do we see now? $5 million for free, guaranteed income for free, the ability to live and never have to lift a single finger again for the rest of your life and for the rest of your children's lives. And potentially, either all or most of your grandchildren's lives. This is no longer giving anybody the tools with which to make a life. This is literally simply providing everything they need to live, so that they never have to do anything, at the cost of everybody else around them. Not exactly dissimilar to the master living in the big house, surrounded by their field of slaves. And what happens after 250 years? For that matter, what could happen before 250 years? Because imagine that you are one of these people living in San Francisco after this passes, who now has to struggle because, well, your taxes are now 80%. Between your state taxes, your federal taxes, your city taxes, everything else. Now that you're destitute, what would you be willing to do to get your restitution? After all, you can now say you've been harmed by something that you weren't even responsible for. None of these people ever owned a slave. None of these people benefited from any kind of discrimination. And yet they have been harmed. So what are they owed now? You could say that maybe they were owed, the $600,000 plus in taxes that were taken from them, but does that also pay for the time that they spent, living in abject poverty because 80 cents of every dollar they made was taken by the state and then given to these people? What about any discrimination that they faced because they were not one of the privileged people to receive it? I mean, people would look down upon them. You're not special enough. You didn't have the right lineage to receive this. And so, maybe not in 250 years, maybe in 300 years, maybe 400 years, maybe 500 years, when things have turned, when the cycle has rotated, when these people's turn comes up and they say, we were discriminated against, we were hurt, everything was taken from us, and we demand to be made whole. What will be fair for them? What will be proportional for them? And from who will the consequences be assessed? This is the primary reason why reparations, while divine in theory, are unworkable. They cannot really be measured. And because they cannot be measured by any system that we have, they can never be assessed. Never in full. It will always be more. It will always be more punishment, always more harm, always more suffering, because satisfaction can never be gained. And so it can only continue until it's unsustainable. Until eventually enough people decide to back off. And that only gives way for someone else who has been harmed to take up the mantle. The end result of this is that no one gets better. Maybe somebody does, temporarily. But it is reigning in hell. Because everything around you will be absolutely destroyed in the process. But revenge doesn't care. Because revenge would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. It doesn't really matter if everything has fallen to ashes around you, everything has crumbled to dust, so long as you sit upon the highest pile of it. And that only lasts until somebody else comes and takes the pile. I don't know what the solution will be. All I do know is that the only way to progress is to leave it behind. The only way to properly deal with reparations is no reparations. But that's not likely to happen anytime soon. Still, though, it is a conversation worth having. I mean, so long as we're not going to let it go, we have to have the conversation, because if we don't talk about this, then we will simply accelerate the process of revenge and the cycle of suffering, and that will just deteriorate things even further. At least while we're having the discussion, we're slowing it down. So I think that's where I'm going to leave this one off here. I can't really think of anything else to add at this point. I think I've covered pretty much every topic that I wanted to, and I hope, maybe I hope against hope, but I hope that perhaps this may have given you a new outlook, a new theory, a new perspective on the idea of reparations, restitution, retribution, and revenge, both as what we would consider a judicial approach to it, as well as a cultural, social, and moral approach to it. At least that's what I was going for. Did I make it? Did I accomplish what I set out to do? I don't know. If you know, though, I would appreciate it, though, if you would let me know down in the comments. So, all I can say right now is, if you got anything out of this at all, if you thought this was worth anything at all, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to get notified. I'm trying to do these lectures every Saturday. I'm running out of topics. I have one for next week. After that, kind of running on empty. So if I have a lecture, or if I don't have a lecture one of these weeks, it's because I don't have anything. I'm trying, though. However, since this is a very hot topic right now, if you know anyone else who is discussing the idea of reparations, share this video with them. I know it's a long video. I try to do longer form videos because I want to have longer discussions. I want to get into nuances and explanations. Share this video, though, if you think somebody might enjoy it. But otherwise, if you enjoyed this at all, leave a like. Leave a comment down below. I would appreciate any comments down below, especially if you have your own thoughts on this. I try to answer every comment that I get, and if you want to leave your own thoughts below, we can have a long discussion on this kind of thing. Or if you don't like doing that, but you still want to have the discussion, I have a Discord server. It's linked below. It should be linked below. I'll double check it, but it should be there. You can always join the Discord server and we can have that discussion. I do not discourage anyone from coming on my Discord server to talk about heavy issues. All I ask is people be respectful. You want to insult people? And we're going to have a problem. But if you want to have a discussion, come and join us. Otherwise, though, I'm going to get out of here. I'm taking a break. Give me something to eat. And I guess I will see you next week for another lecture. And until then, take care.